All right, it is good to see everybody. Got a great crowd already for Bible study. We're glad everybody's here. Be turning your Bibles to Hebrews chapter 9. Hebrews chapter 9, this is where we are in our study of Hebrews. We'll do our best to work our way through chapter 9 today. I did put out a new sheet for chapter 10. If you want to grab a copy of that either right now or after class, that will be for next week beginning. And so you'll need that. Go home, take a look at it, look at those questions, kind of get a sense of where we're going in our study of the text. And then hopefully you've jotted down some notes. We come back next week and then we can all put our collective thoughts together and work our way through Hebrews chapter 10. But we're in chapter 9 right now. And the more I worked on chapter 9 this week, the more I thought, I don't know if we'll get through that. It's just, there's a lot packed into chapter 9. And I don't want to rush the first part because the first part leads us to make a good conclusion on the second part, which is the contrast between the earthly tabernacle and the heavenly tabernacle. All right, so we're still under question number 1. And in our notes, question number 1 said this: why does the writer talk about the earthly tabernacle? And this is through verse 5 of chapter 9, but that argument kind of extends through verse 10, where in verses 6 through 10 he talks about the tabernacle and the services of the tabernacle. So the next question is, what is he showing the readers about the tabernacle and the services of the tabernacle? And right now we're just in the first 5 verses. Okay, so what we did last week, and we never got into the description of the tabernacle itself, we just got into a sort of a contrast between the earthly tabernacle and the heavenly. We made that last week. All the contrasts we see in the chapter, you have an earthly sanctuary, then you have a heavenly. So those two are set in contrast. We have one that's a type and a shadow. We have the other that's real. So we have that contrast. We have one that cannot be accessed by the people. He'll mention that in verse 7. But we have the other, the heavenly, where people can access that through Jesus Christ. You have one that's temporal. You have one that's eternal. And then you have one where the services of that tabernacle could not satisfy the demands of redemption, and then you have the other that could do that. So that's what we're dealing with in chapter 9. So let's talk about what we're seeing regarding the tabernacle, beginning in verse 2. A tabernacle was prepared, the first part in which there was the lampstand, the table, and the showbread, which is called the sanctuary. And behind the second veil, the part of the tabernacle which is called the holiest of all, that'd be the most holy place, which had the golden censer, the ark of the covenant overlaid on all sides with gold, in which there was the golden pot that had the manna, Aaron's rod that budded, and the tables of the covenant, and then of course over it, the cherubim of glory overshadowing the mercy seat. Of these things we cannot now speak in detail. So let's take a look at these individual components. Now, if we go back to the Old Testament to take a look, do you think that his list here in chapter 9 is meant to cover every single detail, or is it basically a summary of the tabernacle? It's got to be a summary, because there's a lot more that's mentioned about the tabernacle in the Old Testament than what's mentioned here. And one of the emphases in the Old Testament is the courtyard itself and the dimensions of that. If you go back in the Old Testament, you look at Leviticus and you look at Exodus and the combination of what they tell us about the tabernacle. The tabernacle was 150 feet long by 75 feet wide. Very nice, big area. It was surrounded by a special kind of fence. Remember what the fence was made of? What was it bordered by? It was a certain kind of cloth. Yeah, fine linen. It had fine linen around it. The entrance to the courtyard, there was a curtain that was hung on 4 posts on the east side where the curtain was to enter into the courtyard. But he begins, the writer does, first of all, with what's inside the holy place. So remember, if you can visualize and look at a picture of the tabernacle, and by the way, many Bibles in the back, you have, like, in addition to maps, you might have a picture of the tabernacle itself. You had the courtyard. All right, and you had on the courtyard, the brazen laver and things of that sort. And then you go in, you have the holy place, you have the most holy place. There's 2 parts to the tabernacle. So the first part, he describes the contents of the holy place. And the first thing he mentions here is the lampstand. What was that? All right, guys, the candlestick, all right? And you've likely seen images of it. You have all these prongs coming out of it. You have 7 individual of those, 6 branches and 1 upright, so 7 total. If you're looking at a map, and especially if it's pointed directionally, this would be near the south wall. It was made of pure gold. It stood 6 foot high. So if you're about a 6-foot male, or you know somebody that's about a 6-foot male, I'm close to 6 feet. It would be about as high as I am, candlestick. Then there's the table of showbread, the table of showbread. This was opposite the lampstand. So you had one on the south wall, then you have the other, the table of showbread, on the north wall. It was made of wood, but it was overlaid with gold. It was 3 foot long, 18 inches wide, 2 foot high. And it was made with rings, a lot like the ark, so that it could be carried on staves. They'd put staves through it and carry it. So they had poles to carry that. And all the dishes and all the vessels that were on it were made of gold. And then you have something that is oddly placed in this list. He mentions the lampstand, the table and the showbread, of course, and then it says that's called the sanctuary. And then he says behind the second veil, the part of the tabernacle which is called the holiest of all, and it said, verse 4, the golden censer. But the golden altar of incense, if you're looking at the Old Testament and the pattern for the tabernacle, where exactly was the golden altar of incense? In the most holy place or in the holy place? It was in the holy place. So the question is, how can he list it, according to verse 3, as being behind the second veil? How could he do that? Any thoughts on that? Why would he say that? And maybe some of it has to do with the language here. Look carefully at verse 4. He says, which had the golden censer, and that would be the golden altar of incense. Notice in verse 2, as you're reading, he says, the first part, in which was the lampstand, and in which was the table, and in which was the showbread, the implication is. And then when he moves to the golden censer, he says it had. And the word had here is the word that means it belonged to. What would that tell us? Is he talking about location or function? He has to be talking about function. What was the function of the golden altar of incense? Any guesses? Okay, before a person would go into the most holy place, what did he have to utilize? The golden altar of incense. So in a sense, while it was located in the holy place, the function of it was in association with the most holy place. So when he's talking about the golden censer, because it had the golden censer, he's simply saying that the function of that particular object related to the most holy place. This is not a mistake. He's doing it on purpose because in function it belonged to the Holy of Holies. And if we go back and especially read Leviticus chapter 16 about the Day of Atonement, we would find that the function of it prepared the high priest to go into the most holy place. So there's no contradiction here. Just an FYI on that, because that does come up in certain circles, and critics of the Bible point to that and say, you got a contradiction there. It's not a contradiction. He's simply pointing to the function of the golden censer, or the golden table of offering. All right, so the one thing, though, that's inside the most holy place, and the one that everybody knows about, right? You can even ask kids, what's in the most holy place? What is it? It's the Ark of the Covenant, okay? It was a wooden chest, but it was overlaid with gold. It was 4.5 feet long. It was 2.5 feet, 2.25 foot wide, and 2.25 foot high. It had rings on the side, which is very important because it's supposed to be carried on poles. Remember the story of Uzzah? Uzzah gets killed because he reaches to stabilize the ark. And when David is angry at the Lord for having killed Uzzah, because Uzzah was just trying to do a noble thing to keep the ark from falling, God reminded him you had put it on a cart, and it never should have been on a cart in the first place. And so it was carried. Exodus 25, almost that entire chapter beginning in verse 10, deals with the Ark of the Covenant. And inside there were 3 interesting things. One is the golden pot that had the manna. Why was that there? Okay, remember in the wilderness they were fed with this special bread from heaven. Exodus chapter 16 is a great chapter. The golden pot of manna was a constant reminder of God's power and faithfulness to the people. So as long as it stayed in the ark, It was a reminder of that. Then there was Aaron's rod that budded. You remember the story behind the budding of Aaron's rod? What was the dispute over that started that? Do you remember? It was a dispute over what, Gene? Who gets to be in charge? And there were men who said, why do you get all the power and all the authority? And then, of course, there was a miraculous display in Aaron's rod that budded. Why would that be such an incredible thing? Oh, it's a dead piece of wood, right? You have like a walking stick. Imagine having a walking stick that's not attached to a vine, it's just a dead piece of wood, and all of a sudden it begins to sprout and grow. That was a miracle. Numbers chapter 17, which was a continual reminder that the Levites only could fulfill the priestly function. And then you had, of course, the tables of the covenant. Specifically, you had the 10 commandments. You had the Decalogue inside the ark. And then above the ark, you had cherubim, the cherubim of glory. Exodus 25 tells us about that, beginning in verse 18. If our understanding is correct, we did a class several years ago on angels and demons, and it seems to be a difference in the Bible between cherubim and seraphim. Cherubim seem like agents of justice. Every time we see them, they seem like agents of justice. Here they would emphasize the glory of God as they face and they bow each other, and they are over the mercy seat. This would be the covering or the lid, which is interesting because the idea of covering, the same word is used in Romans 3:25 of Jesus being our mercy seat. And then, of course, he at the end in verse 5, he says, of these things we cannot speak in detail, meaning that he's only offering sort of a condensed version of the tabernacle. Now, all of that, if it was disconnected, we would think, well, why would he list all that? Why go through all of that? It's to make the contrast that he's about to make in chapter 9 between the earthly and the heavenly. All right, so let's pick up in verse 6 now. We did not get to verse 6 last week. Now, when these things had been thus prepared, the priests always went into the first part of the tabernacle, performing the services. But into the second part, the high priest went alone, how many times? Once a year, not without blood, which he offered for himself and for the sins of the people committed in ignorance. The Holy Spirit indicating this, that the way into the holiest of all was not yet made manifest while the first tabernacle was still standing. It was symbolic for the present time, in which both gifts and sacrifices are offered, which cannot make him who performed the service perfect in regard to the conscience, concerned only with foods and drinks, various washings, and fleshly ordinances imposed until the time of the Reformation. Now, we've got a separate question about verse 9 and about this idea of the conscience. We're going to talk about that. But we're still part of this first question about the bringing to our attention the details of the tabernacle. So there's not a whole lot here that's not, I wouldn't think any of this is hard. It's just sort of the follow-up. He's talking about now not the elements, but the people who did the service in the tabernacle. So in verse 6, he's talking about just the average ordinary priest who would be able to be admitted into the holy place, the first part, and they performed divine services in the tabernacle. But only the high priest was allowed, according to verse 7, into the most holy place. He was allowed once a year. What do we call that day? The Day of Atonement, right? So the Day of Atonement, Leviticus 16, he was allowed into that place, and it says, not without blood. What's that mean? All right, so he had to make sacrifices. He had to offer sacrifice, first of all, the Bible says, for himself, and there's a reason for that. Unlike Jesus, what did he have? He had sins. He was a person that sinned, so he had to make atonement for himself just so he could be in it, but he also had to make atonement for the people so that he could offer for them. So going before the presence of God was a serious thing. And I want to pause here because this is, I think there's a point sometimes we miss about this concept of going before God. And it's established in the Old Testament based on this physical set of circumstances about going before God. They had to be clean. They had to be atoned for before they could go before God. How is it possible that any of us could stand before the presence of God without impunity? How could we possibly do that? Yeah, it has to be based on blood. Terry, what were you saying? Okay, yeah, okay, that was ripped and taken down. There's no way that anybody could ever be in front of God in his presence without there being a remission of sins, without there being something. So to stand in the presence of a holy God, a person has to be holy. They have to be sanctified. They have to be redeemed. I just want to point out two examples in the Old Testament to sort of reinforce this point, because to me, at least to me, it helps me today understand that if I'm going to, for example, if I'm going to go boldly before the throne of grace, I'm going to stand before God, I'm going to bow before Him in worship, I have to be a redeemed person to do that. It doesn't make me sinless, but it does mean that I can't bring before Him an impenitent life. I've got to fix that through the blood of Christ. So Jesus is my access to the Father in doing that. So let's look at two examples. Look at Leviticus chapter 9. So I want to slow down and look at these examples. Leviticus chapter 9. And I want to go toward the end of the chapter. So this is the beginning of service, right? Everything's been outlined. All the administrations everybody's been delegated to what they're supposed to do, and now it's beginning. And the very first thing that happens is the glory of God descends on the camp, which is an indication in the Old Testament of the presence of God. Look at verse 22. Then Aaron lifted his hand toward the people, blessed them, and came down from offering the sin offering, the burnt offering, and the peace offerings. And Moses and Aaron went into the tabernacle of meeting and came out and blessed the people. Then the glory of the Lord appeared to all the people. Now, this is the first time that the glory of the Lord has appeared to the people like this. Now, before that, they'd seen during the day they had a pillar of cloud. At night they would have a pillar of fire. So you've already had some manifestations of God. But now the cloud, so to speak, is descending on the camp. It's coming down on the camp. What do you think the mindset of the people would have been on this occasion? What do you think would have been racing through their mind? Would there have been some excitement? Maybe some apprehension and some fear? I think there's a lot of mixed emotion on an event like this, because they are visibly seeing this manifestation of a cloud descending on the camp, the glory of the Lord descending on the camp. It would have been a remarkable thing to see. Then in verse 24, and fire came out before the Lord. You think that would have excited the emotion of the people a little bit? Indeed. And consumed the burnt offering and the fat on the altar. So imagine you're watching this, but your eye starts to descend a little bit to the altar, and all of a sudden fire just comes down and whoosh, the offering on the altar is just consumed in fire. Would that have been a very sobering moment? All right? So there's a lot to consider emotionally in this moment. And when all the people saw it, they shouted and they fell on their faces, right? So there's a moment when all this is taking place. God's presence is in the camp. Verse 1, chapter 10. Then Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, each took his censer and put fire in it, put incense on it, and offered profane fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them. Now, you can surmise motive all you want in this passage. You could keep on reading, and there could be an indication that maybe they had been drinking a little bit. I don't know. Maybe you can say they were just caught up in the emotion of the moment. I could even understand that. But is what they did right? No, what they did was wrong, because they offered strange fire which the Lord did not command. Now watch this. You've got a holy God who's now descended upon a camp, and Nadab and Abihu, are they holy? Holy people standing directly in the presence of God. Watch verse 2. So fire went out of the Lord and devoured them, and they died before the Lord. And listen to these words from God, verse 3. This is what the Lord spoke, saying, by those who come near me, if you're going to approach me, then what do they have to regard him as? Holy. And that has to be reflected in our life. Not that we deserve being there, that we earn being there, right? That somehow God owes it to us. But there has to be some reflection in the life of the person who comes before God, and it has to be holy. And when they were standing there in the presence of a holy God, and they were deliberately unrighteous by offering strange fire, they couldn't stay there. And so God consumed them. And that pattern stays the same all the way through the Old Testament. Now, go with me to the book of Numbers. Numbers chapter 16. Numbers chapter 16. It's a long chapter. We're not going to read the whole chapter. I'm going to use the very end of it to illustrate that this theme is true all the way through the Bible. And you visibly see it in the Old Testament, right? You can physically see the consequence of it in the Old Testament. Number 16. Now, we're not going to read the chapter, but if you look at the very beginning of the chapter, you have a heading above chapter 16. What's going on in chapter 16? All right. Mine says rebellion against Moses and Aaron. And you have, if you look at the names real quick in verse 1, you've got Korah, and then you've got Dathan, Abiram. You've got these people who rise up in rebellion to Moses and Aaron. And it's like Gene was saying earlier, they've got this big debate of who gave you the right to be in charge. We want some of that authority too. And God, in a mighty way, demonstrates that he has exactly who he wants in charge, because this is the part where the earth claves open, right? You have the splitting of the earth open, and it just swallows the rebels up, and the earth closes back on top of them. That's not the end of the story. Go down with me in Numbers chapter 16 to verse 41. All right, verse 41. On the next day, all the congregation of the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron, saying, "You have killed the people of the Lord." So their complaint is, we just watched the earth open up and swallow these rebels, and now we've got complaint against that. And who is the orchestrator of that? Who did that? Was it Moses and Aaron? It was God, right? Now it happened when the congregation had gathered against Moses and Aaron that they turned toward the tabernacle of meeting, and what happens? Who is in the presence of the camp? God is. Is God holy? And what's the state of the people in this moment? They are not holy. Now watch what happens. And the glory of the Lord appeared. There's the cloud descending upon the camp. Then Moses and Aaron came before the tabernacle of meeting. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Get away from this congregation, that I may consume them in a moment." And they fell on their faces. And Moses said to Aaron, and you can just see this. This is a word picture moment, right? You can see it play out. Moses turns to Aaron. He says, "Take the censer, put fire in it, put incense on it, and take it quickly." Now, if you update the language, what's he saying? You run and get this done, because he knows what's about to happen. You've got a holy God. His presence is there. You've got unholy people standing in the presence of God. And he says, "Run, Aaron, make atonement for the people. Make atonement for them, for the wrath has gone out from the Lord. The plague has begun," because unrighteous, unholy people cannot stand in the presence of a holy God. Then Aaron takes, and as Moses commanded him, he ran in the midst of the assembly, and the plague had already begun among the people. So he put incense, he made atonement for the people, and he stood between the dead and the living, and the plague was stopped. When did the plague stop? When he made atonement for the people, when they were covered by blood. And those who died in the plague were 40,700, besides those who died in the Korah incident, or 14,700, so 14,700 besides those that died. So Aaron returned to Moses at the door of the tabernacle meeting, for the plague had stopped. So here's an illustration twice in Leviticus 9 and in Numbers chapter 16, where when you have the presence of the Lord, whoever comes before him has to be atoned for, right? So when Moses did this, the Hebrews writer when these people entered the most holy place, it was not without blood. They could not enter without blood. And that's his point in Hebrews chapter 9 in verse 7, when they not without blood. Now, there's an interesting statement at the end of verse 7. I want to get your thought on this. He says, "Which he offered for himself and for the sins of the people, for the people's sins, committed in ignorance." What does that mean exactly? Okay. If you commit a deliberate sin and you know about it in the Old Testament, did they have a means of taking care of that? You go to the priest, you make an offering, right? But is it possible that throughout the year, as you've been living and acting and working and talking and speaking and thinking, that you've committed sins? Is it possible? So I think here the idea is these are just sort of, these are generic sins that have been just committed throughout the year, and now they're about to do something about that. Tom? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think there's a difference between a willful, deliberate, knowing you're doing the wrong thing, and in the Old Testament they had a process to deal with that, and here the idea would be sins committed in ignorance would be sort of just generically listing sin in general. I think that's the emphasis here. Steve? Yeah. Yeah, a lot of them didn't. Interesting, his name was Jesus Barabbas. You had a choice of two Jesuses on that day. Which Jesus will you choose? I think it's probably a pretty good lesson. Verse 8. So he makes the point now that all of this that happened in the past, the Holy Spirit was able to use this as an object lesson. All of this in the past, right? It was symbolic for that time in which both gifts and sacrifices were offered, but he makes the point that even though all of this spectacular thing was taking place, it could not make the people who did the service or those who received the atonement perfect in regard to the conscience. And then he returns to verse 10 when he tells us about how that it was largely an emphasis on the physical, what was visible, when he says foods and drinks, washings, fleshly ordinances imposed until the time of the Reformation, which would be the New Covenant, right, the New Testament. So all of this was in vogue. It was part of that system until the New Covenant came in and took it all away. All right, so when I go back to verse 9, this is question number 2 now. I want to go back to verse 9. There's something interesting said at the end when he says, they cannot make him who performed the service perfect in regard to the conscience. And this is super important. In Hebrews, it's part of his argument about how we understand the Old Testament. So number 2, as part of his argument, he refers to the inability of the law to make people perfect in verse 9. In what way could it not make perfect? What does this mean? And then we're going to connect this to Hebrews 9:14 and also Hebrews chapter 10. And we also have a follow-up in the next chapter on this, the first question of our Hebrews 10 notes. The writer between these passages is showing us something about the Old Testament. And from this argument, what do we learn, or what can we learn about forgiveness and the relation of forgiveness to the Old Testament? So let's talk about this in verse 9. If you're looking at verse 9, and we're just quoting the Bible, in what way could it not make those people perfect? A remembrance. Here he uses the word conscience. And drop over to verse 14. Of how much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, cleanse your what? Conscience from dead works to serve the living God. So twice in this passage, he talks about the cleansing of the conscience. What is the conscience? What is that? And I'm going to come right back to what Tommy said in just a moment. There's a word that sort of connects it all, but what is that? Remembrance to the sins that you committed. All right. So in the Old Testament, with all this physical, there was a lot of physical activity, right? Several in this class from the beginning have mentioned there was a lot of physical service, right? There's the preparation of the animals, and you have all the attention to the measurements and the details, and there was a lot of focus on the physical, and something was happening when all of this, even when the atonement and the Day of Atonement was taking place and all of it was being made, the worshiper who walked away from it was still unsettled in one place. And it was the one place where it should have been the most affected. And where's the one place where he was not affected where he should have been? In his mind, in his heart. And there was something about the worshiper in that, in spite of all that he had done, there was something unsettled about the conscience of the worshiper in the Old Testament. Now, go down to chapter 10. Tommy mentioned the word remembrance. Go down to chapter 10. Look at verse 1. For the law, having a shadow of the good things to come, not the very image of things, can never with these same sacrifices, which they offer continually, year by year, make those who approach perfect. But now going back to chapter 9, in what way could it not make perfect? Regarding the conscience, right? He said it twice in chapter 9. Look at verse 2. For then would they not have ceased to be offered, for the worshipers once purified would have had no more, here's that word again, consciousness of sins. Then verse 3, but in those sacrifices there is a reminder of sins every year. So connecting it all, right, where was the issue? Was it in the outward physical? Where was the issue? It was in the heart of the worshiper in the Old Testament. Now I'm going to go into a lot more detail when we get into chapter 10, but let's put ourselves in the shoes of the worshiper, right? In the Old Testament, you go to an altar and read Leviticus 16. We're not going to read the chapter, but just take some time to read that as a supplement. And the Bible clearly says, if you have iniquities, if you have transgressions, if you have sins, when you go and you offer this offering, what's the result of that? What was the promise of the Old Testament? You'll walk away what? You'll have atonement. That's what the Old Testament said. But what are you offering? You're offering animal sacrifices. Now, they're smart. They're smart like we are. Somewhere in the recesses of the mind of the worshiper, they were unsatisfied because they understood that an animal life does not equal human life. And they walked away every time thinking, how on earth did I just get atonement? They could not have that settled in their mind. They couldn't do it. The Old Testament never answered that question for them. Now, there were anticipations, but they struggled with their understanding of redemption because they knew that animal life was not an exchange of life, because the principle in the Old Testament is life for life. That's what it was. You give one innocent life in exchange for the guilty. But an unblemished lamb is not the same thing as a human being. It could never equal that. So they struggled in the Old Testament with that question of how is God working out salvation, because the full revelation had not been made. They didn't understand the connection to the blood of Jesus Christ. And again, we're going to talk about this in more detail in chapter 10. We'll answer the question of how did forgiveness work in the Old Testament. I want to spend some time on that hopefully next week, because it's a big question. Were they forgiven or were they not forgiven? And if they were, how could they be based on animal blood? Or was there more than that at work? And we have some indications of that as we go through the chapter. Real quickly, let's move to number 3. I want to try to get mostly through chapter 9 today. All right, so number 3, using the illustration of a will, right? You do this, you have you hire a lawyer, you get an attorney, and they do some will planning for you, estate planning. Using the illustration of a will, how does the writer show the necessity and the superiority of Jesus' redemptive work? So let's read verse 11 beginning, and then I'll get your thoughts on this. But Christ came as high priest of good things to come, with the greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is, not of this creation. So you see now he's starting to contrast all of that with the earlier part of the chapter. Not with the blood of goats and calves, but with his own blood he entered the most holy place once for all, having obtained eternal redemption. Now that's important. Eternal redemption is important. That word eternal means something to us. If the blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of a heifer, sprinkling the unclean, sanctifies for the purifying of the flesh, how much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve the living God? And for this reason, he's the mediator of the new covenant by means of death for the redemption of the transgressions under the first covenant, that those who are called may receive the promise of eternal inheritance. For where there is a testament, there must also of necessity be the death of the testator. For a testament or a will is in force after men are dead, since it has no power at all while the testator lives. Therefore, not even the first covenant was dedicated without blood. For when Moses had spoken every precept to all the people according to the law, he took the blood of calves and goats with water, scarlet wool, and hyssop, and sprinkled both the book itself and all the people, saying, this is the blood of the covenant which God has commanded you. Then likewise he sprinkled with blood both the tabernacle and all the vessels of the ministry. And according to the law, almost all things are purified with blood, and without shedding of blood there is no remission. All right, what's his point here? We read a lot of verses, but he's got really a major point here. What do you think it is? So the big one, I think, comes right in the middle. I think he's using a very practical illustration. If you enact a will, right, you designate how your possessions are going to be allotted, when does that will become effective? All right. When you die, you have to die, and then your will becomes effective at your death. Okay. So Jesus instituted a will. He has he says what he wants. I'm going to build my church, and he does all these things. And when does that become effective? At his death, right upon his death. His death has to provide the ratification process for this will, which should be for the readers the one point that would turn them around and get them back to the new covenant, because if the Lord died and they knew that he did, then we live under a new covenant. So this goes to this overarching theme of you need to come back to the New Testament. But he's doing this as a way of contrasting Old Testament, New Testament, based on everything he said about the earthly tabernacle. So real quick, In verse 11, he proves that Jesus now serves in a greater and more perfect tabernacle because it's not physical, it's heavenly. In verse 12, he did make an offering, but his own blood, which is better than the blood of bulls and goats. In verse 12, it's eternal redemption, and if something is eternal, this will be part of our answer next week in chapter 10. If something is eternal, is it bound by time? It's not bound by time. God doesn't work like we work because he's not bound by time. But it's eternal redemption. And in verse 12, it is offered one time, once only. In verse 13, he's talking about how the Old Testament draws our eyes to the body and to the fleshly things. It was by design to do that based on the purposes of the law that we talked about last week. But in verse 14, the work of Jesus draws our eyes in a different direction. It's not to the physical. Where does it draw our attention? To the spiritual. Now, that doesn't mean there's not outward things that we don't have to do or obedience that we don't have to accomplish. We do. But the work of Jesus is meant to satisfy the soul and cleanse the conscience. Now, just a note, we get to talk about this a little bit tonight because we're talking about the concept of the Godhead, and there are three members of the Godhead. Notice in verse 14, he mentions who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God. And my question is, what is that exactly? Who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God. When do you think that is? Okay, think it's the death on the cross? Or could it be a reference to something after the death on the cross? If it's not the death on the cross, what could this be a reference to? When he offered himself to God. And I'm doing this on purpose because there's something that happens that doesn't get as much attention as the death and the burial and the resurrection. And those are incredibly important. They're history-changing series of events right there. All right? But he was on earth for a number of days, and then something happened at the end of that period. What happened? How important was the ascension? Why was it so important? All right. This is it, okay? Heaven is his tabernacle. And when the high priest is making an offering, where does he present that offering? In the most holy place he presents that offering. And when the Lord ascended back to heaven, it is at that moment that he presents himself to the Father. That's when his offering is presented to God the Father. Now, I would give you two passages real quick. We're running out of time. Mark chapter 16, real quick. Look at Mark 16. Mark chapter 16. Look at the very end of Mark chapter 16. Listen to this language, verse 19. And the other reference will be Acts chapter 1, 9 through 11. We won't have time to read it, but look at verse 19. So then, after the Lord had spoken to them, he was received up into heaven, and sat down at the right hand of God. What does the word received mean? I'll give you an alternate translation. The word here means accepted. At that moment, his offering was accepted, and he entered into the most holy place where he now serves as high priest. How important is the ascension? Cannot be saved without him ascending to the Father. It's important. It's part of this contrast. So I think maybe in Hebrews chapter 9, now it very well could, and I certainly believe the Holy Spirit certainly has a part in his resurrection, because in Romans 8 it mentions that the Spirit helped raise his body from the grave. But in verse 14, when it says, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, I think that's a reference to his ascension and the moment he presents his sacrifice to the Father in the heavenly tabernacle. And at that moment, he has made it possible to be cleansed in our conscience from dead works to serve the living God. Just my thoughts on that. All right, let's put a peg in it right here. We'll really quickly finish up chapter 9 and get into chapter 10 next week, and hopefully connect those two, especially the early verses of chapter 10, to some things we talked about today. Thank you guys so much. Appreciate it. And look ahead in chapter 10, because there's some very practical, challenging parts about if you're going to be faithful, then don't forsake the assembling of the saints. We'll talk about that hopefully next week too. Thank you guys. Appreciate it.